1994, where he was working with the Action contre la faim as a food security expert. And since 1999, he has worked for the Emergency and Rehabilitation Division of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. He's covered major humanitarian crises, including Kosovo, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Somalia, the West Bank, and Gaza Strip. And as mentioned before, my name is Loretta Hieber-Girardet. I'm the chief of OCHA's work on intercluster coordination. That's in the program support branch in Geneva. So we're very pleased to have quite a few participants today. You come from many different countries. We see we have people joining us from DRC, from South Sudan, from Niger, from Afghanistan, Myanmar. We've done a little bit of a poll beforehand to see what is the roles that you're playing. We have more than a dozen cluster coordinators. We're joined by at least 6 humanitarian coordinators, humanitarian country team members. So we have a very diverse group of people who are with us with many years of experience working in humanitarian operations. And so I'm very pleased to have you all on board because the issue at hand is really of critical importance. Can we make coordination work in the field? Can we make sure that it's fit for purpose? I'd like to maybe just start off by setting the scene a little bit. What is the role of a humanitarian country team? What is its responsibilities, and how does that differ from the responsibilities of an intercluster coordination group? Well, I think it's important to remind ourselves that the humanitarian country team is the strategic and operational decision-making and oversight forum in a country. And it's led by the humanitarian coordinator, and its composition typically includes representatives from the UN, IOM, international NGOs, the Red Cross, Red Crescent movements as well. So it has an utmost role in making sure that the policy and the strategy of the country is well defined so that the intercluster coordination group can fulfill its role and its functions. And those functions are very much linked to the core functions of the clusters. And maybe it's worthwhile to review what those functions are. It's to support service delivery by providing a platform that ensures that that service delivery is driven by the strategic response plan. It's set up to inform the decision-making of the humanitarian country team. So that means that the intercluster coordination group has responsibility for needs assessment, for needs analysis, for making sure that gaps are addressed, and for formulating priorities on the basis of analysis. It's also responsible for developing cluster strategies and cluster plans, monitoring and evaluating its performance, and it has a capacity building function as well. And finally, advocacy. So in many ways, you could consider the intercluster coordination group the engine room of a humanitarian response, while the humanitarian country team has overall responsibility for setting the strategy. But in reality, is this relationship really working as it should? Is that there mutual reinforcing going on that's meant to be? Is the HCT providing strategic vision to the intercluster, and is the intercluster providing the HCT with the information that it requires in order to make decisions? We've seen from several operational peer reviews that there are delinkages right now between the two groups and that they're not functioning really as they should. So that's the focus of today's conversation. And I'd like to start off by turning to our humanitarian coordinator in Afghanistan, Mr. Mark Bowden, and ask him, what happens when the intercluster coordination group and the HCT isn't functioning as it should? What impact does this lack of a cohesive relationship actually have on humanitarian response? So, Mark, over to you. Mark, hi, can you hear me?
Okay, that's an all situation. I can hear you.
Mark, I'm having difficulty hearing you. Okay, I believe we're having some problems with the line.
Hello?
Yes, hi. Okay, I can hear you now, Mark. Yes, so the question is, what is the impact when the intercluster coordination group and the HCT are not functioning as they should?
Well, the impact, I think, is in terms of a lack of certainly a shared vision. It's very difficult to get a strategy operating in this environment. If you're trying to be strategic, if the clusters, say the HCT should be setting the policy and the strategy, if the clusters don't communicate effectively, it's very difficult to move forward at all effectively. And I think one of the problems, again, with the cluster as well, is it limits the overall humanitarian accountability that you get with that between the agencies and the clusters.
So can you give us some of the examples of how you're trying to address this in Afghanistan? How are you trying to improve the linkages between these two groups?
Well, in Afghanistan, we've been going through a major reform of both the HCT and also the intercluster coordinating group. I think over a period of time, as sometimes happens with HCTs, the HCT has grown and grown and grown, and as a result of which it became basically an information sharing body. With that, it's sometimes difficult to distinguish between an HCT and so one of the reforms was to slim down to transform it into a policy-making body, but also to reorganize our agenda so that we had one session of what is the core HCT, and the other meeting that we have regularly is a meeting of the expanded HCT, which is the HCT with the intercluster group working together, which focuses on essentially on providing greater accountability and reviewing the work of the cluster group and working together with the cluster group. So that's one part of it, which has been an overall reform of the humanitarian architecture. The second issue has actually been a review of the various clusters and also a change management in terms of with for a whole lot of reasons.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. We do seem to be having a little bit of trouble with that line right now, so I'm going to
of each of the clusters, streamlining clusters themselves. We have also yep.
Okay, thank you. As I was saying, we're having a little bit of a trouble with that line. So while we try to sort that out, I'm going to turn to Cyril right now and ask him, from somebody who's had many years of experience working in different humanitarian contexts, if you could tell us a little bit more about some of the examples you have of the importance of these two groups working together, and whether you can tell us whether or not you see these linkages as strong or weak right now, and what needs to be done about it.
Thanks, Laurie. Let me start by saying that unfortunately, and with only few exceptions, and Afghanistan is probably one of these, the linkage between the HCTs and the intercluster group is often weak and sometimes extremely weak. there are few indicators or few elements that I've been witnessing in the field that can demonstrate some of these weaknesses, and I will give you just a non-exhaustive list of them. But obviously, when you see in some countries that the agenda of the HCT meetings is very similar to the agenda of the ICC, you are wondering if the two are talking together and if really the strategic decisions are taken either at the ICC or at the HCT level, which is obviously problematic and creates confusion. The other case, which is completely the opposite, is when the HCT and the intercluster group are discussing very different topics, like speaking really in two different and parallel words, where they are never really meeting and where bridges are not really established, and you are really wondering if the HCT is really providing guidelines and these guidelines are being implemented by the intercluster group or vice versa. Similarly, we have been witnessing a number of countries, unfortunately, strategic decisions being taken at HCT level, which are not at all followed by any further discussion on the modality to implement some of these recommendations or decision at the intercluster group. That really demonstrates a significant disconnect between the two. By opposition, strong link are obviously the opposite of that, and are really coming when you really see that decisions that are taken at the HCT level are really leading to some action plans which are implemented and where a feedback process is taking place. That's very much what Mark was saying. It's really about the accountability of the two groups to each other, which often does not exist. From a number of countries' experience and also the operational peer reviews or the Senior Transformative Agenda mission, the state mission, the one in Yemen, but also the OPR in South Sudan or in Central African Republic, there are a number of questions that were coming in that are very, very recurrent, and it is really about who should be chairing these different groups. I mean, and the intercluster group in particular. Should that be OCHA? Should that be the Humanitarian Coordinator? Should that be the Deputy Humanitarian Coordinator? Frankly speaking, what I think is very important in the field is really the Humanitarian Coordinator himself to be aware of what is happening at the intercluster group. I think that's really paramount. Doesn't mean that he has to chair this intercluster group himself, but at least he has to participate maybe on a regular basis, whether it's quarterly, semi-annual, it doesn't matter. But he needs to have a sort of a connection to the intercluster group indirect and not only remotely through feedback that he's receiving either from lead agencies or OCHA, for example. As for the importance of the HCT and the ICC to work together, well, that's very much what I was saying a bit earlier and what Mark also was mentioning, that the clusters and the intercluster group are really the operational arm of the HCT. Operational arm on issues related to need assessment, on issues related to strategic planning, whether it's a HPC cycle altogether, whether it's related to contingency planning and preparedness. Really, the clusters and the intercluster group are really the arm of the HCT. I would like here just to provide one example, which is coming from the last duty station where I was posted, which is in OPT. And the intercluster group was really helpful in framing the advocacy messages of the Humanitarian Coordinator because the link was really established. The HCT was not exclusive to the cluster coordinators as well. I think from time to time it's important that the cluster coordinators also take part of the HCT and can eventually speak from their own voice, because it gives a ground reality to all the decisions that are taken at the HCT level altogether. And again, and finally, I think that the HC, the Humanitarian Coordinator with his function, needs to be aware of the challenges that clusters are facing, whether it's related to resource mobilization, whether it's related to access to beneficiaries, relation to local authorities, involvement of national NGOs as well. it is clear that this dialogue must take place because the Humanitarian Corner is to facilitate. He has a clear role to play on advocacy, on resource mobilization, and on making sure that humanitarian principles are respected. And therefore, it becomes the advocate. He is the advocate of the humanitarian community. And I think that the intercluster group is really helping framing these messages and the ground reality.
Thank you, Cyril. I'd like just to follow up on one of the points you've made. You said that sometimes you see that strategic decisions taken by the HCT are not necessarily followed up by the intercluster coordination group. And I would think that one of the most important decisions of the HCT would be to set the strategic objectives in the humanitarian response plan. So if there's no follow-up or proper follow-up consistently by the intercluster coordination group, what impact is that having on a country's overall operation? Over to you again, Cyril.
Well, again, I think that it leads to a weak implementation of the plan, or to having some gaps. I think that you cannot have leadership that is not informed by the actors in the ground, and vice versa. I think that the one who are implementing the strategies need to really understand what the strategy is. And I think that when there is an ambiguity in these functions and in these directions, then potentially it leads to having a ground reality or activities in the field, or priorities in the field which are not necessarily the ones that have been set at the HCT level. And I think that we are really risking here having the two working on two different dynamics and priorities, and that's of course to the expense of the affected population, unfortunately.
Thanks very much. I'd like to go back to Afghanistan now, where there is a reform process underway that's really geared towards making the HCT and the intercluster more effective. So, Mark, I hope the line is working a little bit better now. Could you take us through a little bit this reform process, maybe as an example for other countries to learn from or to be inspired from? What are the objectives, and how will you know when you've succeeded in making coordination fit for purpose in Afghanistan?
Well, one of the key elements of this is to try to make the HCT a policy and decision-making body. So that in order to do that, we try to get a proper representative structure. And work on the representation side is actually one of the more difficult issues. For example, in the old HCT, donors were very keen to attend, but not because they wanted to be part of decision making, but because in a very insecure environment such as Afghanistan, they felt it was the only opportunity they had to get information and to get out of their embassies. So the first act of persuasion was to actually make the HCT a humanitarian body, and ask the donors to participate in a donor group that I work with, and only to have one representative as an observer with different coordination structures, and getting representation that was effective was also a challenge. So we set the parameters to that representation by saying that we'd have 3 international NGOs and 3 national NGOs. And then we also had to limit on the basis of creating an equal structure, the UN team as well to be 6. So we have 6 NGOs, 6 UN members, which means that we have to prioritize our agency funds and programs membership, but also provide for some rotation, and then work towards having two other observers who are the NGO consortium and the NGO coordination body and the ICRC. So then I think the other key element of reform just on the HCT is to actually make it have a policy agenda and not use it as an information sharing body. So that relies on us to actually, an OCHA, to actually set a relevant agenda for the HCT. As I said, the second part of the review has been to work on the clusters, and we looked over time at merging some of the clusters, defining which were the necessary clusters. There's also been a debate in Afghanistan about getting the clusters, some of the clusters moving into government where they better belong, because taking more development and emergency activities. So part of this to address.
Mark, we are unfortunately still having trouble with your line.
We
okay, Mark. I think we're going to have to drop it there because the line keeps cutting in and out, and it's
okay. I'm not a lot I can do that. We can't get through the telephone either.
It's a pity. I'm really sorry, but the line just keeps dropping in and out, and we hear you perfectly clear for quite a long stretch of time, and then nothing. So maybe, thank you for that. I mean, I understood you were describing why you've gone through this transformation and how you're hoping that this will improve the overall coordination, make the HCT more policy focused, and ensure better accountability of the intercluster group to the HCT. Maybe I would like to move now to William Shamali and talk about the NGO perspective, or at least his NGO's perspective as an operational agency, and the impact that the linkages or lack of linkages from the HCT and the intercluster coordination group has on the operational agencies. So, William, over to you, please.
Thank you, Laurie. Well, I guess the first question to ask ourselves is it's quite interesting to look at two bodies that are to a large extent not trusted in many operations, except several exceptions. You still have a lot of misunderstanding of the roles of HCTs, ICCs, and a lot of skepticism around them. And the discussion becomes quite interesting when we're looking at the relationship between two bodies where you have a lot of skepticism around, and especially from an NGO perspective. The observation from the ground shows an interesting correlation is whenever you have a good relationship between the ICCs and the HCTs, it means that these two bodies are functioning well to a large extent. And I don't know if it's a cause or effect, but it seems to me that in general, as a general observation, investing in the relationship between the two bodies may result to a large extent in a better functioning HCT and a better functioning ICC in general. Now, from an NGO perspective, the functioning or dysfunctioning of the relationship between the two bodies have one major impact, which is the trust and how the operation is conducted and the leadership of the operation. And we know trust is kind of a major factor, especially in larger operations that have direct impact on efficiency on the ground. Another practical layer to this relationship is that if you have good connection between the policy and decision-making body, the strategic direction, and the advocacy voice of the operation with the operational hand of it, which is the ICC, then you have stakeholders who are on the front lines, like NGOs, able, one, to feed into the strategy, which we think improves it tremendously by getting first-hand information from the ground. But more importantly, you have the actors that can actually react fast to changes in policies and directions, and actually can implement and react on the ground by improving the response. Now, in addition to that, the bottom line becomes the capacity of delivery at the delivery point, and it's a bit of a stretch to say that a better relationship between the ICC and the HCT provides direct impact at the delivery point. But the reality is it does. And it does even more when the relationship between the subnational level and the national level is very strong. So that makes me reframe the question. Is it only the relationship between the ICC and the HCT that is important, or we have to add to it a third layer, which is the subnational level, that actually can impact the delivery on the ground? Now, with all of these, there are many examples where we have seen in operations as an NGO, the relationship between the ICC and the HCT works well. And I'll give a couple of examples of what we think makes it work well. In one situation, we've seen humanitarian coordinators, as mentioned by Cyril, participate in ICC meetings. Now, there is a flip side to that coin. Is in several occasions when the first encounter happened between the HCT and the ICC group, the disconnect between the operational side of the operation and the HCT was revealed to be so big that it really increased the size of the challenge by revealing how big is the gap and how disconnected are the two bodies. Now, in situations where this is not followed up, because of course this is an opportunity by identifying the gap to actually try and work on it. When this is not followed up, then the problem is becoming bigger. But in several situations, we've seen this as a first step of acknowledging this gap and actually moving towards a situation where the gap is filled in practical ways. And I think we see today a trend of having in large operations deputy humanitarian coordinators. We think this is a great opportunity. We've seen that in South Sudan, we've seen that in Iraq, to have stronger involvement by HCT senior people, by a deputy humanitarian coordinator in ICC fora to take this to a better level. On another hand, we have seen cluster coordinators periodically or repetitively participating in HCT meetings. And this is very important to have this operational voice. And of course, the theory is you always have the ICC represented in the HCT through an OCHA person. We think this is important and this is great to have it seriously done. But what is complementary to this situation is to have actual cluster coordinators sit physically in HCTs and give real real data-based and reality-based feedback to this body to kind of help inform the decision makers to go in the direction where the operation is going. I would like to reiterate on the fact that the relationship between the ICC and the HCT is not only a formal one. We tend to, as I've done in the first part of my answer, to focus on, yes, we need the HC to sit in this body and we need cluster coordinators to go there, but the actual relationship could happen and should happen outside the actual meeting room or the 1 hour every month where this takes place. I think it's a big role for the humanitarian coordinator to seek direct informal feedback from cluster coordinators on weekly or bi-weekly basis as frequently as possible to keep the relationship going, and that feeds into higher trust. And last but not least, I think the sequencing between the two bodies is very important. And this boils down to simple things like Mr. Bowden was saying, and Cyril was saying, having an agenda that is synchronized between the ICC and the HCT is something very important. But the timing of the meetings, having the ICC meet well ahead of time to feed the results of the minutes and the thinking to an HCT meeting that comes afterwards and can decide based on information brought to the ICC is something very important. And getting the minutes shared and creating part of the written minutes that kind of respond to specific questions from one body to another is something very important. I'll stop here, Laurie.
Thanks very much, William. But before moving on, I would like to pause for a second at a point you made regarding the relationship between coordination at a national and subnational level. Because I do, from my own experience, see that this is often where there needs also to be better linkages. So I would ask you, William, what is your perspective? What is the best coordination model there? We've seen some countries move away from having intercluster at the field level and having more area HCTs. Do you have any views on what is the best way to make that linkage and that relationship also as performant as possible?
Yes, of course. This is kind of where it really boils down to make something efficient or not, and it is to a large extent about resources and capacities. I mean, we face a reality on the ground where there is so much high turnover of staff at the subnational level as well as the national level. You have senior people at the subnational level who are working on 2 or 3 TORs and would want to prioritize going to coordination meetings if they're not sure it will be something useful will come out of them. The move towards having an area humanitarian coordination like we have in Yemen is something we appreciate. It can work in some situations. We've been pushing for it for years in Somalia. It didn't happen. It has political complications to it. But I think I would like to boil it down to resources and appeal to organizations to push their senior staff to prioritize this, but also to donor community to understand the need for resources at this level, because otherwise, as well as the HCT could be at the capital level or the ICC could be functioning well, if we don't have harmonized and really agile and sharp subnational level coordination, the difference is very little at the delivery point. We have seen deputy humanitarian coordinators and humanitarian coordinators going to attend meetings at the subnational level. This has tremendous boosting impact, and it shows the importance that this has on the ground, but also request of having short minutes going from the subnational level to the national level, and with actual responses and follow-up from the HCTs could reinforce this cycle of trust in the value of these meetings. And if you have more trust in the value of these meetings, more senior staff will come and they will become better and more decisions will be made, and it becomes just a positive cycle of doing it. So yeah, this is where I stop on this one.
Thank you very much. I would like to go back to Mark in Afghanistan and to ask him to reflect a little bit on the roles and responsibilities of the different stakeholders in making the HCT and the intercluster work. And first of all, I think I would like to ask you about the responsibility of the humanitarian coordinator and what specific advice and tips you would give to a humanitarian coordinator who might be listening today about what he or she can do to really try to make coordination fit for purpose in his or her country. So, Mark?
Well, I think that one of the key responsibilities of the humanitarian coordinator in terms of the overall structure is actually to make the structure accountable and legitimate as a structure. So that means that it's not a matter of the HC taking all the decisions, but actually having a structure that is capable of making decisions quickly and effectively and at the right level. I mean, we were just talking, I was talking with Kathy Howard, who's with me here, during the last session, also about the role that the humanitarian coordinator has with the cluster leads. Now, in my previous job in Somalia, I mean, there was an issue as to how far the cluster leads should be accountable to the humanitarian coordinator and how much they should be accountable to the heads of agency who had the cluster portfolio. And I think that's actually quite a difficult issue to address. My view is that it's one of these things where there should at least be a dotted line to the humanitarian coordinator, but the direct line management responsibility lies within the agency. So when you look at the humanitarian coordinator's role in terms of clusters, I think again it depends on the skills and experience of humanitarian coordinators. Increasingly, a number of them are coming from the humanitarian background. The NGO background, but clusters have some sense of the policy control function of the clusters. You do need to have a humanitarian coordinator with some experience of different types of emergency and what constitutes effective and quality work and what doesn't. You know, I think those are the other challenges that exist in managing the clusters. The other responsibility, which I just touched on very briefly, is actually getting, I mean, the most difficult area is where the clusters are involved in advising on the use of monies such as the CHF. And the tendency in all clusters, I'll be quite specific to this, is just to divide the money up. They actually find decision making on those issues quite difficult because of pressure within the cluster from the members of the cluster. And then there's a sort of inter-cluster sort of sense of division of we'll get this if you get that approach. So I think the humanitarian coordinator's responsibility is also to move the clusters away from what are seen as fair shares to a rather more strategic approach as to how they use how the money and resources are utilized. So just to summarize, I'd say the HC's responsibility first and foremost, is not to be the main decision maker, but to create a structure that is capable of taking decisions at the right level, amongst the right groups, whether it's the agency, at the senior level, and heads of the NGOs, the right technical decisions are taken at the right level, but also to get the structure more towards working with the division of resources. I'll leave it at that. Hello?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark, for that. We have a few questions coming in, and I would like to... we have a few questions coming in now, and several of them are really probing the question of the role of the cluster lead agency in the HCT. This is something that the operational peer reviews and lessons learned have also shown, that the responsibility of the cluster lead agency to represent the views and the issues of the clusters at the HCT is not always functioning as it should. Sometimes it's felt that the cluster lead agency is representing the agency interest more so than the interest of the agency. So the question is, what can be done about the disconnect between the cluster coordinators and the lead agency representatives in the HCT? And it's a question I'd like to ask all of our panelists to answer just very briefly, maybe starting with Cyril. Cyril?
Yes, Laurie. Yeah, I think definitely it's one of the key issue that we are facing is really the role of the cluster lead agencies and the way they really see their role and the way they really implement it. Because I mean, initially I think that they have to play this bridge. We were talking about OCHA is playing this bridge between the HCT and the ICC, but I really think that that the cluster lead agencies have even a more significant role to play. One is that they have to understand, they have to make sure that they differentiate their contribution to the HCT between what they say as head of agencies and what they say as cluster's voice. When they speak on behalf of the cluster, they don't only represent anymore the exclusive opinion of the agency, but definitely the voice of the group that basically their agency is leading as a cluster lead agency. And to that effect, I think that they need to have a strong relationship with the cluster coordinator. I think William was mentioning that, and I fully agree. I think that this link is often too loose. Before going to the HCT, from my experience, it's very important that the head of agency receives a briefing from the cluster coordinators on the issues, on the problems, on the solutions as well, and the example of what works and what doesn't work, because he cannot represent a cluster if he's not informed of what are the issues that are taking place there. So I think that he needs to receive a proper briefing before going to the HCT meetings. Likewise, the cluster lead agency or the country representative of the agency needs to make sure that it provides feedback as well to the cluster coordinators on what is happening from the HCT meeting. Very often, the feedback process from the HCT is exclusively taking place through OCHA, which is fine, but I think that the cluster lead agency, the head of agency, has to give a feedback to the cluster coordinators, and I think that these are privileged moments on the upstream and downstream relationship that are unfortunately not taking place sufficiently. William was mentioning also the potential of cluster coordinators being part of HCTs. I certainly support that. What Mark was saying on Afghanistan having a restricted HCT meeting to policy and a large group with cluster coordinators on operationalization of some of the aspects is paramount. And I think that it's not always favored by some humanitarian coordinators, but I think that the cluster lead agency has a role to play in promoting that relationship. What I've seen also from some countries is the cluster lead agency encouraging the cluster coordinator or even the HCT to go to the field as a humanitarian country team on some thematic issues. And I think that trying to have the cluster lead agency encouraging the group to say, okay, let's go to the field together on the thematic of food security, on the thematic of health, I think it's quite helpful as well. It really forces, first it gives credibility to the cluster coordinator and the cluster system in general. It's a real strong motivation where attention is paid to them and to the work they are doing, and it helps again the humanitarian country team to think as one on these specific sectoral field visits. So the cluster lead agency has all these roles to play on really connecting the dots. Otherwise, the linkages to the best case scenario very often just limited to the minutes of some meeting, then to what OCHA would do as a bridge, or would say, or would report. But I think that the cluster lead agency has a more direct role to play altogether. Over to you.
Thanks, Cyril. Before speaking with the other participants, maybe I'd just like to ask you, in your experience, do the cluster lead agency representatives always know what their responsibilities are to the clusters? And if not, what is it that can be done to help reinforce their understanding of their responsibility?
Well, I think that they do understand their responsibility. I think it's what we are saying in the field is that the same story, the same situation for cluster coordinators themselves. I think that when the cluster is working well is when we have a dedicated cluster coordinator who is not double-hatted with his agency, when he really dedicates 100% of his time to the cluster and is detached from the operation of an organization. I think that it's not always difficult for a head of agency to implement that approach, but definitely I think most of the time they do understand that need for delineating their role as head of agencies from the one of a cluster representative. So I would say that in vast majority of the cases, it's a reality, and it's a marginal moment, marginal countries where it's not an absolute reality. What is happening in those cases, then headquarters of these agencies have also a role to play in making sure that their country directors fully do understand that responsibility. So I think that there are a number of reviews and discussions that are taking place between headquarters, between country level, that are quite important to prevent that misunderstanding to happen. Over to you.
Thank you very much. And now let me go back to William. And again, maybe from an NGO perspective, when you have cluster that are co-facilitated or co-led by NGOs, how can we make sure that the cluster lead agency, which is typically a UN agency, is actually representing the interests of the cluster and not only its own agency's interest in the HCT?
Yes, I think Cyril's answer was quite comprehensive, and it covers a lot of the NGO points. So I won't repeat. I agree with it. I will just add two elements that I've seen interestingly important. One is the dynamics of feedback from the cluster lead agency, from the HCT engagement to the clusters in a meaningful way, not only information sharing, but kind of creating an extension of the discussion that starts at the HCT to the cluster and vice versa, and taking the time for this makes the engagement quite interesting and creates a positive dynamics and makes the trust of the cluster members and the cluster lead agency representing them at the HCT grow just by the extension of this dialogue. The second important point is the support that the cluster lead agency gets from its cluster members is also very important. Sometimes even if the cluster lead agency individual representative doesn't really understand or embrace their role of separating between the two hats, I think it's easy to nag and make the point that they're not doing their role. But if we treat them as such when we are cluster members and keep doing a matraquage on that role and feeding them information, expecting this information or a line of analysis to go to the HCTs, and then follow up informally with other HCT member and supporting these point of views, makes the cluster leads agency realize the benefits of separating between these two hats and more embracing it.
Thank you very much. I would now like to go to Mark with a question that has come from our audience or from our participants, and this relates to how the intercluster coordination group, but I suppose we can also say the HCT as well, how they should relate to government coordination systems, and what are we seeing as particular challenges there? And how are you addressing these in the context of Afghanistan? So, Mark?
Okay, well, it is an important question, and one that I think is quite difficult in many different environments on this. The government here, in some ways, we're quite fortunate in that the recognition from actually the head of state down of the need for the independence and impartiality of humanitarian action is quite strong. But it works within certain confines. So where we're working in what I call contested areas, there's a strong recognition of the need for a respect for humanitarian principles, and the government would not be involved in the direction or management of aid. Where there are more sensitivities are on the issues of natural disaster response, where the government feels it has legitimate ownership of this area and needs to be strongly involved and in a sense more directive, but doesn't have the capacity to address this. So some of the challenges in so government on the clearly identified humanitarian issues, which is assistance in contested areas in line with humanitarian principles, it's a matter of informing government and keeping them informed as we do also with all parties to the conflict, who we keep well informed. In terms of those issues that fall into the more into the domestic domain and are related to development issues, government is more directly involved in the coordination, both in coordination and also, as I mentioned earlier, in actually taking on the function of some what was previously taken on by clusters, such as in the area of education. I mean, I think that the other area that we've looked at in on the cluster side, where there's a closer engagement with government, is both in WASH and potentially in shelter, where the government are in important players. I hope that helps to answer the question.
Thank you very much. And maybe I'll ask the same question of Cyril, thinking of your experience working in the occupied Palestinian territories and other contexts. How is the intercluster coordination group and the HCT functioning alongside the government? And do you have any tips, any recommendations for other listeners here who may be struggling with some of the same questions? So, Cyril?
Well, from the experience in Palestine, I think that I mean, the humanitarian coordinator was of course liaising quite often with the government. There were some dedicated meetings to meet with the Ministry of Planning, and I think that was quite useful, where there was really an exchange between the government views and the HC representing the HCT views altogether. So I think that there was at least a convergence or the establishment of convergence of ideas of what the humanitarian priorities are and would be, and that was quite helpful. I would also say that to a large extent this was relayed at the cluster level, in the sense that government was taking an active role in the cluster system, including for the definition of cluster response plan and strategy, but also at the vetting when there was still the CAP system and the project profile vetting. The government was taking place into the vetting process. So I think that the linkage was really strong, and that helps obviously first building the buy-in from the government to what a humanitarian appeal would look like, and what the humanitarian strategy and priorities would also look like. And it was very helpful also for the government to understand what potentially are the constraints that the humanitarian community would be facing, and why eventually some element of what the government would consider being a priority would not necessarily be reflected into the overall humanitarian strategy. So I think that in Palestine this linkage was pretty strong. On food security was not a cluster but a sector, and there was a steering committee for food security, whereby Ministry of Planning, Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Social Affairs were the three of them taking part of the strategic decision on the direction of the cluster, including on the duration that the sector should be operating, for example, which is also important when we consider the process of formal activation and formal deactivation, where I think that the dialogue with government is probably not strong enough. But in countries where it is in place, I think that this is working very well, and the conditionalities for deactivation are clearly established. Over to you.
Thank you. I'd like to read a comment from one of our participants and ask William Shamali of the Danish Refugee Council to comment on it. The question and comment is, do you think national staff need to play a bigger role in leadership in both HCT and the intercluster, so we have a better understanding on the realities on the ground and the unseen hurdles of coordination that arise from culture, language barriers, etc.? Unfortunately, many times it feels like the HCT ICC cluster meetings are for internationals who are disattached from the realities of the field of the country. So I guess, William, the question is, are we not being cooperative enough, not only with governments, but with our own national partners, our own national staff? Should they be more visible? Should they be playing more of a leadership role in the coordination mechanisms in the country?
Thank you, Laurie, and thank you for the question, Hadi. This is a very important question. I was just 2 weeks ago in Budapest discussing some of the issues related to the World Humanitarian Summit, and probably this is the biggest topic: is how the role of national NGOs, national civil society, in this whole humanitarian response strategies and coordination. I take your point at two levels. One, yes, national staff do have a very important contribution to give to coordination. They can be agents of facilitation of understanding links between humanitarian classic actors, development actors, and government, but also putting things in a wider context. But this is not where I put the biggest importance. The biggest importance, I think, is for national NGOs and their capacity of national NGOs, because I wouldn't want my answer to be seen that national that we're creating a competition between a national UN staff and an international UN staff. I've answered that there is an added value of having national staff, but I think the more important side of things is how do we get local civil society more involved in these coordination bodies. I can see the role very important at the subnational level. And bringing it to the national level depends on a couple of things. One is resources and capacities. Do we have enough willingness to push for the resources of local actors to be built to an extent where they can actually dedicate staff to spend their time and focus on coordination at the national level? That's something where we have seen many good examples on. Especially in natural disasters, but less and less so in conflict areas. And I'm putting black and white here, which is not totally accurate, but I think that would be more or less a reality on the ground. The second thing is to understand that if the purpose is actual delivery, better delivery on the ground, the participation of national actors who are mostly at the delivery point in national level fora could be very advantageous in terms of feeding into strategies, but in many situations could create the challenges in access for these organizations. So it's really contextual. I can think of a couple of examples where we would really benefit in having national NGOs, and I think what Mr. Bowden is doing in Afghanistan is quite interesting in this sense. But on the other hand, there are many very important players in delivery where their participation and national coordination can create challenges of access. So does that mean we have to ignore them? No, but we have to create another line or layer of feeding into their knowledge and expertise into the national process. Lori?
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. We have several questions coming in now. And one specifically I would like to ask to Mark in Afghanistan. The question is how to deal with the challenge of having the humanitarian coordinator double-hatted as the resident coordinator. Does this impact on your ability to push for humanitarian principles? Or what about an integrated mission setting where the HC is also the deputy SRSG? How can one overcome the perception of a conflict between humanitarian priorities and political or military ones? So that's the question I'd like to put to Mark from our audience or from our participants.
Right. Well, I can't sort of say that there aren't conflicts there, but I think sometimes they're overstated. Having been in my one of my past jobs as RCHC, being very against integrated missions, I made the case that integration at the time was inappropriate in the context of hot conflict. So I think part of it is still to maintain the discussion about when integration or close integration works. It was designed by Brahimi originally as a post-conflict structure, not as a structure to be used in conflict. But it does also depend on the mission and not just on the RCHC. Here in the mission, we have an SRSG with a very strong civil society, human rights background who fully understands the need for separation, and there's never any pressure or any conflict, or rarely, I should say. It's always impossible to say never, but you know, where the mission leadership actually understands the need for separation of roles and functions, it works quite well. Sadly, there are, in my experience, only a few SRSGs that understand the need for separation. So, I mean, my answer is not to lay it on the DSRSG, but actually to look at the issue of integration, and in a sense, this is an issue for Valerie Amos and others to address more systemically, as they did, I think, in the case of Somalia. So that's part of it. In terms of the RCHC issue, I think, again, it comes down more to the issue of experience amongst RCs and HCs. In theory, one should be looking for synergies between the two. I mean, for me, humanitarian action is not about keeping people in a state of humanitarian grace, if I can put it that way. It is about moving people, providing people with the support that is needed, or the political protection that is provided by international humanitarian law, to give them assistance when they need it, but actually to develop longer-term and more sustainable development solutions. So there should be far more of a handover between the HC and the RC functions, and people should be looking for synergies, while respecting the need for humanitarian independence. Again, I think that a lot of making those synergies work is actually a better understanding between agencies, so we have more of a common strategy in how we move out of a critical humanitarian environment to a more sustainable development environment.
Can we just stay with that theme a little bit longer, Mark, because there are a few more questions that have come in related to ensuring linkages between the HCT and the UNCT in contexts where the humanitarian early recovery development agendas are being set. And, how concretely, you've given a few ideas, but how concretely can we overcome these big gaps between humanitarian relief and development activities? And what's your experience been to date in getting development actors to take on or to follow through on the important work that relief efforts have achieved? So these are some questions that are coming in specifically to you on that link between humanitarian and development work.
Well, again, I think it depends on the type of crisis that you're dealing with. I mean, the most critical area to maintain those links is actually in a famine or in cases of food security, where I think massive food insecurity. Also in the area of natural disaster issues, where those are quite important. There I found that the humanitarian work, particularly the technical side of things like of food security, having an effective IPC and other things, can actually inform development activities far better. So the linkages to me are quite clear on the food security side. Having better, stronger nutrition surveillance system as well can inform national nutrition policies. So a lot of the sort of famines that I've been involved in over the years, I think, have led to stronger national food security strategies. DRR, I think we're still struggling to make the links there effectively, because we aren't getting into better land use management and other areas post-DRR, or I don't see those links. Where I get worried about the humanitarian side sometimes is on the health interventions, because for me, effective health systems, I mean, effective health delivery depends on health systems. And there's quite often a danger that humanitarian action undermines and fragments existing health systems and structures. And that's where I think we still have a lot more to do in terms of making the linkages. And in Afghanistan, we're facing major problems in that we're using the CHF to provide emergency healthcare for civilian casualties. And also in negotiating humanitarian access, we're also trying to make sure that the access is for healthcare within a system of health delivery. Now, sometimes those systems are compromised and politicized, and we have sort of clear problems in doing that. But you know, there are still, I think, and perhaps for discussion at the cluster, at the sort of global cluster level, you know, perhaps more of a discussion needs to be had on this. What I think didn't work, if I can be quite blunt about it, was having an early recovery cluster. And I think many, because that was a sort of artificial way of looking at the linkages. And I think that, you know, for me, the development humanitarian linkages, you know, need to be better discussed, as I said, I think more at the global cluster lead level.
Okay, let me go over to William Shamali and ask your point of view. What can we do to improve the linkages between the humanitarian and development actors? William.
Yes, I guess Mark covered it really well, and I think I want to reiterate on his point regarding the early recovery cluster, so he's not the only one being blunt here. But I would like to talk about a specific phase, which is more when the humanitarians are phasing out in terms of programming, and more development actors are taking in, and this whole handover between the different actors. What we have seen in places like, let's say, for example, Burundi, where the clusters were, I don't know if they're shut down, but yeah, but become idle basically, is a proper handover under the form of a large-scale data collection exercise that kind of synthesized what remains of the humanitarian challenges, but was put in a development language. And this is very important, and I'll give you an example. If a humanitarian actor say we have, I don't know, 1,000 households in this village, what they mean is 1,000 persons who share a meal every day. When a development actor say there is 1,000 households, they mean 1,000 people that live under the same roof. So just a basic example of how humanitarians read household versus how development actors do is very different and can mean different things. And apply that to many other concepts and terminology, especially when it comes to issues like protection and legal frameworks in the country. What we have seen so far is a lot of focus at the global level systematically to have better data processes that make actors work together at the beginning of a crisis. We have seen much less systematic work that facilitates the inclusion of development actors in a way that takes into account the humanitarian achievements, but also what remains of humanitarian challenges that will have to be taken care of by development actors. Over.
Thanks very much. I'd now like to ask a question of Cyril. There's been a lot of work that's been carried out in the last 2 years on the humanitarian program cycle, an effort to move from a project-based appeals process to an evidence-based strategic planning process. And this includes making sure that the HCT is really setting the strategic direction of a response, but that this decision-making is informed by data and evidence provided by the clusters. And we've had one question from Turkey suggesting that the strategies are not always using cluster data, and that the evidence base perhaps isn't really being used to make decisions. Let me ask you, in your experience to date so far, how is that relationship working between the HCT in the cluster, in the strategic planning process, and how can it be improved?
Well, if I look at food security in particular, I think that there is a tool, and Mark was mentioning it. Was mentioning the IPC, which is the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification. So I would say that in countries where there is such a tool, such a food security tool that is existing, the relationship between the programming and the evidence-based need analysis is pretty strong. In other countries where there is no such a tool, unfortunately, I think that it remains a little less straightforward linkage between the evidence and the response. Let's not forget as well that one of the significant actors in our working environment is also the donors, and we know very well that the donors are not necessarily extremely well equipped also for the transitional part from emergency to development, and a number of them are going to insist that a certain category of activities are included into the humanitarian appeal, because that's the way for them to finance an activity which doesn't necessarily need to be in that humanitarian appeal. So I think that there is a bit of a vicious cycle as well on what the evidence we are having and what eventually we are doing, because we have to accommodate a certain form of reality, including the one of funding altogether. So again, I would certainly think that one of the potential tools, but I think it's not necessarily working extremely well at the moment, is the vulnerability index. I think that in some countries we have seen this kind of multi-sectoral indexation of vulnerability, which is potentially of interest. Unfortunately, I think it's not properly implemented for the time being, because the clusters and the lead agencies are not necessarily systematically involved in the process of it. And I've seen some countries where they are, and others where they are not. So if you remember 10 years ago, there was this idea of an IPC-like or humanitarian IPC, which would not be limited to food security, but to the broader range of humanitarian indicators that would cover health, nutrition, and all the other clusters. I think that that's something that is missing for the time being, and that is unfortunately not fully covered or addressed because of the process system, not fully addressed by the vulnerability index mapping that we are witnessing in some countries. So my recommendation here would be obviously to start looking at it and making sure that the different indicators and the weighting of the indicators within a cluster and the weighting between clusters is something that is taking place. And I think that unless we are able to do it, we will still be having a sort of I'd say, possible questioning about whether or not we are addressing the real priorities and setting the right priorities for humanitarian intervention. Over to you.
Thanks very much. And maybe I'd go back to Mark now, because Afghanistan is one of the countries that has been using a vulnerability index. What recommendations, what suggestions can you make to participants in the webinar today to ensure that there's strategic planning and that the information coming from the intercluster to the HCT is really grounded in the best data and evidence that's available in the country? And how much is this lack of evidence a problem for you, including in the mobilization of resources, which are shrinking everywhere? Mark?
Well, the problems in Afghanistan are quite serious. I mean, I think we have developed an HRP. I keep on getting my language wrong on this, but in any case, I think we've developed an HRP that is very much data-based and evidentially based. The problems in Afghanistan are that there is a massive data deficit here in terms of information that is available, far more than I'd realized, and is the case, I think, in many other countries. So it does require a lot of work, and both by agencies, NGOs and others, in terms of data collection. And actually we try to use the CHF, for example, at least in small part, to fund data collection and management, to see that as an essential part of humanitarian activities. So that's one bit of advice I can give. I think that the clusters themselves can contribute by focusing as much on their normative standard setting role, particularly in areas like nutrition and other areas, by getting agreed protocols and focusing a bit more on the data management issues. And I think that OCHA plays a very important function on this. I think part of the reason why the HRP is so good here is because of the work done by OCHA in developing an appropriate methodology that actually utilized what data we had effectively on this.
Thank you very much for that. Before we ask each of our panelists to wrap up with a few words of advice for our participants, I would like to answer a question that's come in which regards the role that OCHA can play when cluster lead capacity is not up to the level or is affecting the response. And indeed, what we have been seeing through some of the field missions is that there is sometimes the need to support, especially new cluster coordinators in the field, to get up to speed. What we can do from OCHA's side is also alert the global clusters when there is a situation on the ground. But there are some other references and tools that you can refer to. For example, I would encourage all of you participants to take a look at the ISC reference module for cluster coordination at the country level, and to make sure that the members of the clusters are aware of this guidance document and are using it on a regular basis, and making sure that they're actually referring to the core functions. The other important element, and Afghanistan is a case in point, is the real utility of undertaking an annual coordination architecture review. This was stipulated as part of the transformative agenda, but we have not yet seen all countries systematically take a look at whether or not their coordination architecture is fit for purpose, whether or not the clusters that are activated, whether at the national level or at the subnational level, are really where they're supposed to be, led in an appropriate way, and doing what they're supposed to be doing. So this annual coordination architecture review is really a chance for the HCT to come together and to make some decisions on putting the right coordination structure into place. And just remind participants that what we're hearing a little bit through the consultations in the World Humanitarian Summit is a sense that coordination is too heavy, that it's become too bureaucratic, that it's become too formulaic, and that coordination is meant to be fit for purpose, and that therefore there is a requirement to constantly, or at least once a year, review how is coordination working. A few other tools that you may be not aware of, and I would encourage you, is the cluster coordination monitoring tool, which is an opportunity for clusters to really look at how they're functioning. I would encourage you to ensure that this is done not just cluster by cluster, but if it can be done together, jointly. It gives a good overview to the HCT of where there's need for more support for the cluster's functioning. And also, I'd like to remind our participants that the Global Cluster Coordination Group is a resource for clusters in the field, and this is a body that's convened by OCHA that looks at how the clusters are functioning in the field and has been undertaking missions to the field. Most recently, we've had a team in Turkey, which is helping the Intercluster Coordination Group look at its functioning, look at how it's working with the HCT, and to propose some action plans if required to make sure that the linkages are there. So that's one of the purposes of the Global Cluster Coordination Group, and we would encourage you to call upon us if you would like support in the field. So we just have a few minutes left. I'd like to just ask our panelists to sum up, maybe in a word or two, what advice they could give to the field to make sure that the linkages between the HCT and the intercluster coordination works better. So 30 seconds each, starting with William Shmali.
Yes. It's a real job to make the coordination work both at the ICC and the HCT, and my main observation from field operations is the more we have our best staff dedicated for these kind of coordination bodies, the best outcome we can get, and the added value that we can have in effectiveness at delivery points supersedes what is perceived as a possible waste of time or diversion of the attention of senior staff. So it is worth it if we send our best people, and then it has better possibility to work.
Cyril, Ferran, over to you.
Two things. One is I believe that my recommendation would be that the cluster coordinators take part of the humanitarian country team, even as observers, but at least that they are the best person to represent the group that they are working with, which is the range of humanitarian actors, NGOs, national, international. So I would suggest that the cluster coordinators are part of the HCT on a more regular basis. And one question we didn't ask, or one aspect we didn't cover, is whether or not the intercluster itself is a reality and is working, and I think not. I really think that at the moment the SRP is a juxtaposition of cluster strategies under the hierarchy of overall outcomes and outputs. However, it's still a juxtaposition of cluster strategies. And what we should be doing, and the HCT and the HCT in particular should encourage, is a more joint programming at country level. Over to you.
Thank you. And then over to Kabul. Mark, you're undertaking a reform process in Afghanistan with the intended purpose of making our humanitarian efforts more effective. Any final words of advice to our participants today?
Yes, well, I mean, I think that the issue is to work towards common strategic objectives, and if you find you haven't got objectives, push hard to get them, and make sure that the HC and others live up to their job, which is to steer that process through.
Okay, thank you very much. Before hanging up, I would encourage all of you to fill out the poll. We'll be repeating the webinar this afternoon, so your inputs would be very useful. I would thank all of our panelists very much for taking the time to address this issue. We'll be looking forward to hearing in a few months' time how the reform has been going in Afghanistan, and hopefully we'll be hearing about more success stories in the field as well, about making coordination more fit for purpose. So that's it from us. Thank you very much for joining us, and have a good day, everyone.